One second. Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Actually, before we get started, I should just remind you all to select the language you want to hear from the interpretation menu, which should be at the bottom of your screen. The conversation today is taking place in English, but it is being simultaneously translated into Portuguese. So make sure that you select the right channel using the interpretation button. I will try and speak a bit more slowly than I normally would in order to make that a bit easier. So please just bear with me. So this is the third conversation taking place in this series, Decolonization in the 2020s, which has been organized between Afterall, which is a research and publishing organization based at Central St. Martin's, the Museo de Arte de Sao Paulo, MASP, Goldsmiths Department of Visual Cultures, and UAL's Decolonizing Arts Institute. To very briefly introduce myself, my name is Amber Husain. I'm a managing editor at Afterall. We publish a journal, a number of book series, and a range of online projects. And we're extremely lucky to be joined this evening by Margarida Waco and Diego del Valle Ríos. Diego and Margarida will be in conversation for 30-40 minutes, after which we will start looking at questions from the audience. So please do post these in the Q&A box as we go. It's maybe easier to use the Q&A box rather than the chat, just to keep everything in one place if possible, but the chat is also fine. So to introduce our speakers, I'll start with Margarida. Originally hailing from Angola, Margarida Waco has a master's in architecture from the Royal Danish Academy, KDK, and the Aarhus School of Architecture. Her work lies at the intersection of architecture, research, publishing, and curating. She heads up strategic outreach for the Funambulist, which is a publication which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot in the next hour. It's a magazine dedicated to the politics of space and bodies. She's also an assistant researcher at KDK, the Royal Danish Academy. Now, Diego del Valle Ríos is an editor, cultural manager, facilitator, and an independent writer. Since 2017, he's been editor-in-chief of Terremoto magazine, a platform dedicated to the dissemination of critical thinking around contemporary art in the continent known as America. Having previously lived in Guadalajara, he has worked at Arena, please excuse my pronunciation, Arena México Arte Contemporáneo, in Talley Mexicano de Gobelinos, Páramo Galería, and the Diáresis collection. He's part of the independent study group Círculo Permanente de Estudios Independientes, Menos Foucault, Más Shakira. And he recently participated in the editorial project Crónicas de Sangre Impura, co-edited with Andrea Pacheco through Felipe Manuela in Madrid. So without further ado, I would like to get the conversation going. Obviously, we're talking about publishing today. Diego and Margarida have both contributed a short essay to this event series, giving their thoughts on sort of the key challenges and possibilities they see for publishing and attempts at decolonization within the publishing sphere for the coming decade. So those will be published after the discussion on afterallartschool.org in English and on the MASP website in Portuguese. So I thought to start things off, I will hand over to the two of you. Either one of you can go first to talk. Okay, Diego, why don't you talk first about just introduce briefly your work at Terremoto, and what kind of coloniality, decoloniality, and post-coloniality mean to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, thank you to you and Amanda for inviting me to this series of talks and essays. First of all, I want to thank to all the people that are being following these themes and unfolding research reflections through the academy and through own experiences in the margins. that makes this this conversation possible. Well, as I was introduced, I'm Diego del Valle Ríos. I'm the editor-in-chief since 2017 of Terremoto magazine. The magazine is based in Mexico City, and it was founded in 2013 by Dorothée Dupuy, a French curator who moved to Mexico City 7 years ago. And well, what we've been doing, Terremoto started as a blog in 2013, and 2 years from that, we started generating original content, editorial content. First, through the editorial guidance of Natalia Valencia, a Colombian curator. And well, as I mentioned, I joined in 2017 after Natalia stepped out. In those terms, well, as we can see, or as we can understand, Terremoto was founded by white women, white migrant women in the context of Mexico City. Mexico City being the center of the nation state that we know as Mexico, which is important to acknowledge that is occupying the indigenous land of several indigenous nations throughout the territory. From there on, with all these layers, being myself also a person that benefits from heterosexuality and whiteness, as an editor, I've been looking or trying to treason that pact that allies me to the racist order that we live in this country. Thereon, the editorial activities that I've been doing in terms of decoloniality or anti-colonial practices is searching of how to redistribute the power that comes with the position of an editor, and thereon the position of an editor in a magazine that is positioned as our slogan says, contemporary art in the Americas. So thereon it's aligning to an understanding of the Organización de Estados Americanos, the American State Organization, of how it reads this part of the world. And it's again aligned to a North-South dichotomy. It's aligned to an understanding of the world through a geopolitics that still erases stories, experiences, and knowledge that does not enter into the Western-centered epistemologies. So thereon, Terremoto has been trying from there to redistribute that power, questioning what does it mean to decide who is writing about what subjects in the several contexts that we live in, with the mission of also articulating a region that is as a global South, we can say, that considers not only the South idea of the continent, but also considers all those marginalized or historically oppressed communities in Canada or the US. So what I've been doing basically is a way of equilibrating or fracturing all those canons through the contamination, we can say, of all those bodies that are uncomfortable for the hegemony. Thereon, where I understand as decoloniality in this geography, specifically in this context, and I'm talking not only in terms of Mexico, but on the context of all former Spanish colonies, is a process of rethinking ourselves in relation to power, and a way of articulating the possibility of articulating politics of restoration, of paying and repairing. Decolonization is a non-ending process, is a provocation to destabilize the world, to hesitate language, to bite our tongues and doubt of our own experiences, considering or taking as a point of departure what philosopher and psychologist Soli Rolnik calls the capitalist colonial unconscious, in which our bodies are totally part of a necropolitical system, in the case of Mexico, or in Mexico City specifically, a system that not only exploits, explodes, and kills every type of body, from a natural body to female, feminized, or indigenous bodies, but also maintains a military nucleus around the narco war that we've been living for the last 20 years. They're on the position that I choose to incarnate as an editor of a magazine is a position of someone that is trying to burn out the factories of whiteness.
Thank you very much, Diego. That was a great introduction. There's obviously crossover, but you're working in very different contexts. So Margarida, could you also tell us a bit about your work with the Funambulist, your kind of reading of the project of decoloniality, and any other ideas that you'd like to introduce before we start the conversation?
Yes, allow me to just share my screen. Is that possible?
Yeah, it should be. Can you?
Let me see here.
Should be at the bottom. There's a green.
All right. So you see my screen, my PDF?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Just a moment. And you still see it?
Yeah.
Good. Yes. So, Amber, thank you very much for the very warm welcome and introduction. I'm very humbled and happy to be here and to be given the opportunity to delve into these questions with both you and Diego. Just a minute. Yeah. So firstly, in a quest to call the agency of the publication into question in a time of, how to say, political, cultural, and social upheaval, what for me proved to be vital was what I have attempted to formulate in the following two statements. So firstly, how do we strive to curate alternative stories that extend the agency of the publication to the marginalized subject? And secondly, how do we lend this power to stories that allow us to understand the world through multiple voices, angles, and perspectives, when curatorial practices, which is really what we do when we publish, abound to a sort of knowledge base that is defined by a Western gaze, and sort of with all these implications that follow with this very particular way of viewing the world. So in an attempt to provide a few yet inconclusive answers, I'll allow myself to delve into the politics of publishing as we carry out through our editorial practice at the Funambulist. So basically the Funambulist is an editorial platform that exists through three complementary channels: a blog, a magazine, and a podcast that was launched in the blog first in 2010, and then the podcast arrived in 2013, and then we finally launched the very first issue of the magazine, which is published every other month since 2015. And initially launched in 2010, the Funambulist has for the past 11 years articulated questions that relate to the political dimension of the relationship between bodies, design, and the built environment. And as such, we are assembling an ongoing archive for anti-colonial, anti-racist, queer, and feminist struggles. As of today, we have released 34 magazine issues, where each issue has been dedicated to one particular topic that tends to mobilize different geographical contexts and various scales, from architecture to clothing to food politics to labor. And then latest, our international issue that celebrates the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune. This also means that we have collaborated with more than 400 extraordinary people that are located around the world, who have not only given to the Funambulist the quality of its editorial line, but also informed it in such a way that have become paramount for advancing critical discussions. And the particularity of these contributors is that, or sorry, ever since we launched, we have dedicated to mobilize this international community of activists, practitioners, and academics by providing this platform where these different voices could potentially meet and ultimately build international solidarity. And these are some of the grounds that we have covered so far. So many of the contributors are not directly related to the disciplines of architecture design, but rather to humanities or political activism, which really allows for crucial bridges to be constructed between the two worlds. So I will speak a bit about what we call the politics of contents of the publication. Publications are here to relay, to produce, and to curate knowledge. However, publishing is inherently political. It is an instrument of power. And furthermore, it's a contested terrain in which power is continuously negotiated and where most of the global population continues to be silenced. And from this positionality, how do we then lend this power to stories that allow us to understand the world through multiple voices, angles, and perspectives, as I started asking in my introductory statement? And this will basically be addressed as the politics of content. For decades, universities and cultural institutions have been operating in a way that consists in valuing knowledge produced through as a simulacrum of objectivity, which basically means that the more one is presumably remote from a given situation, the more the knowledge one produces about it is considered as valuable. On the contrary, and revisiting our editorial practice, we operate through an inverse bias that embraces the subjectivity of situated knowledge. So in a quest to center incarnated knowledge, we are able to understand the world through the particular political situations of which we are addressing. And in turn, this is where the notion of usefulness comes into question. And to elaborate a bit on this notion, I will allow myself to provide a few examples. And the first one is what you see here on the screen, which is our 22nd issue titled Publishing the Struggle, where we revisited some canonical historical publications alongside some contemporary ones from around the world, many of which were strongly inspired by Fanon. One of the particular publications so these are some of the spreads from this issue, and one of this particular publication that I just want to delve a bit into was the legacies of the Black Panther newspaper. So the catalyst of this publication was the all too familiar case of Black Death at the hands of the police, with a particular event of the death of a 22-year-old Denzel Dowell in 1968. Frustrated by the lack of information from the law enforcement, Dowell's family turned to the Panthers for assistance, and in response, they published a 4-page newsletter to mobilize community support. And the birth of this newspaper basically provided a medium for an alternative perspective about the organization, the Black Panther organization as such, and about the crisis confronting Black America. And not only did the newspaper vocalize Black struggles locally, but encouraged Black Americans to imagine themselves as part of a global community of struggles, for instance, declaring solidarity with Palestine, with what was going on in Biafra, in Mexico, Vietnam, China. And basically learning from these historical lessons, publishing thus became sort of a social political intervention and a site of potential progression of liberation struggles. So it allowed the oppressed and the racialized bodies to understand their own political realities and enabled them to organize and struggle against those realities. The second example that I would like to bring forward is our latest book from 2019 titled The Funambulist by its Readers, Political Geographies from Chicago and Elsewhere. When in 2019, we were commissioned by the Chicago Architecture Biennale to produce a book for the event, a number of questions arose. What does it mean to collaborate with an institution that is affiliated with an oil company? So the BP, who also happens to be the main sponsor of the event. In addition, what does it mean to contribute to an institution that was conceived under the former mayor of the city, Rahm Emanuel? Just for a brief contextualization, during his 8 years of tenure, his administration shut down 49 public schools, encouraged the gentrification of neighborhoods predominantly inhabited by Black and brown working class, and reinforced a police force that practices what even the US Department of Justice itself has called a pattern of practice of unconstitutional abuses, especially targeting Black and Latin individuals. So in this confrontation, we decided that the key notion emerging from this book should be the notion of political usefulness, if not operative, for those fighting on the ground. So this is why we basically tested this notion by inviting 20 regular readers of the Funambulist to pick amongst them one particular text in the first 22 issues that appeared to them as being particularly politically useful, and to explain it for the anthology that we gathered, which was then republished in this book. And in addition, and rather than ignoring the political reality of the context that the Biennale was situated, so the first part was these texts that we revisited, and the second part was basically attempting to challenge the institutional framework of the Biennale. And in these conditions, our participation to the Biennale was conditioned on making this critique heard through voices of 5 Chicago-based activists to write about the spatial politics of the city in relation to one being settler colonialism, one being the municipality, the police, the real estate pressure, and the school system, as well as basically dedicating a third of our total production budget to their honoraria. The last thing I'd like to speak a bit about is what we define as the politics of form. So yeah, in this last part, I would like to call into question the vast range of political, ethical, and social formations of production when running a publication. So again, this will be addressed as the politics of form rather than the content, as many political elements that usually remain undiscussed have become an inevitable part of our everyday activities. And similarly, our editorial work requires us to confirm a number of decisions that have important political consequences, but rarely get addressed as part of a larger debate within the industry itself. Questions such as what choices are being made to generate revenue, as one question, who form part of the decision-making process and why, whose voices are being heard, and how are the voices that do emerge given greater or lesser legitimacy, or even relatively visible in the constructions of global narratives. Is the content accessible? What are the networks of distributions? What are the working conditions of those individuals, basically external part of the editorial formation itself? This saying the labor bodies outside of the ones being part of printing operations or distribution logistics. Is the content free? And if not, does the price change depending on the content or on the context or the social status of the readers? And I mean, this list of ongoing questions. However, I mean, these questions basically constitute an important part of our editorial endeavors. And although our answers through practice-based examples cannot reach perfection, whether we are applying a price differentiation based on different geographical locations, or attempting to develop more content in open access, for instance, as you see here on the screen. This was the latest project that we basically launched, which is titled The Funambulist Correspondence, where we once every week publish a new text in open access, or exclusively providing free access to a particular issue, as we did with the Pan-African issue for everyone living on the African continent, to make the magazine useful in that the particular continent when we dive into the Pan-African imaginary. I mean, so basically these questions remain at the center of what constitutes the Funambulist.
Thank you so much for that, Margarida. That was an amazing introduction to all the work that you're doing. I want us to talk more about these kind of practice-based endeavors, as you just put it, and to pick up also on the idea of political usefulness that you raised, because you've both talked or written about how kind of critiques of colonial oppression are appropriated by publishing institutions, and how kind of symbolic claims, like, you know, claims to inclusiveness or diversity can kind of shore up the existing power of those institutions rather than redistributing it. So can we talk a little bit about, and maybe you have questions for each other about this, because, you know, of the different work that you're doing, kind of about a bit more about how your respective publications kind of endeavor to break with that tendency. So both are obviously very concerned with centering marginalized voices, the voices of those who are actively involved in struggle, and then what you just highlighted, Margarida, about foregrounding the voices of readers as well. I think what would be interesting to hear is a bit about how the material, how it's commissioned, how it's distributed, and an issue of the publication can kind of tend towards that sort of political usefulness. That's a question for both of you, really. So I don't mind who goes first.
Well, in that sense, well, in Terremoto, we've been working throughout soon to be 20 issues. Each issue has 12 articles, both in English and Spanish, also as a way to make the text and ideas, reflections circulate beyond that language, beyond the languages. I wish we could do it also in Portuguese, but there's also the implications of translation and the cost of translation in all this equation. It's important to say that Terremoto is a non-for-profit, so as the same as the Funambulist online is open access, and the print version is freely distributed around the continent, mainly right now through bookstores that consider the arts or theory, art history in their catalogs, museums, independent spaces around the continent, as well as some galleries or art fairs when they were art fairs, of course. So, and by the way, I have one Funambulist, only one. I wish I had more. And well, this is a printed version of Terremoto. We're planning to return to printing for the 20th issue. The 18th and the 19th only exist online because of the COVID circumstances. It wasn't a possibility to continue printing in terms of not only costs, but also in terms of distribution. So of course, some things that we've been trying to rethink through the actual present in regards the difficulties to transport the issues because we usually do it hand to hand, for example, in which we give 10 copies to colleagues or friends that are visiting, or that we consider that we were in the same city for any reason. So the printed version works as a way of breaking, or let's say of escaping the limits that the digital version has in terms of social media. For example, for us, it's very common that Facebook censor our content because of political themes that they read as as in terms of contaminating or disrupting the democratic order of the politically correct arena that are social media. So that is something that we're continuously trying to fight. For example, right now, Facebook does not allow us to promote our content that much. We have limited possibility of visibilization through that platform. And well, of course, it depends also on our how to say, IPN, that is the code of our internet in the huge infrastructure of the world. So of course, if we promote or we publish anything online, it limits itself to the region of Mexico, maybe Central America, according to our statistics, and it's very hard to reach to other regions. When we reach to those regions, is because of our readers that follow us with compliment. And of course, the printed version allow us to move beyond those limits, allow us to maybe be in physically in archives. For example, we're lucky to be in archives of some universities in the US, of some universities in Chile, in Argentina. That also allows a possibility of re-encountering the text from other perspectives and from other way of approaching the themes. Right now, what we're trying to rethink in terms of distribution is, of course, we reduce our copies, or we're going to reduce our copies for the 20th issue because of costs, of course. Right now in Mexico, the cultural sector is struggling. The government has actioned since last year a law that is an austerity law, in which, in the populist logic of this government, they have tend to create a narrative around the arts as something that is from the privileged class. Mm-hmm. That even though it is in its history and in several ways, that reduction, that is essentialism, it's continuously erosioning the possibilities of finding funding, of accessing to grants, or any fiscal possibilities that in the past were allowed. So in those terms, by reducing the amount of copies, we are trying to understand another way of reaching out to our network through that physicality. In that sense, I believe a lot in the power of the printed word. There's a reason that we're still trying to pursue to do it. That is mainly because of the possibilities of conservation and of keeping information beyond the radar of censorship. Mm-hmm. And in that way, what we're trying to do with any type of distribution is we're reducing the distribution points around the continent, and we're motivating our allies or our friends and colleagues. Then when they receive a box of 25 and copies, they try to follow other ways of distribution, whether it's hand by hand, whether it's by leaving copies somewhere random in the places, by getting copies to people that they know that they may be interested, or making a small event of giveaway with, of course, all the precautions due to the pandemic, in which just giving the copies freely to anyone that is interested. It's a continuous challenge, that one of understanding other ways of circulation. Of course, there is the challenge of escaping the echo chamber that the arts sometimes becomes, or the endogamic relations that we tend to perpetuate. But it's also the way in which trying to look other distribution points, mainly through independent spaces, for example. That's a way that has been working for us a lot, in which colleagues or friends that have small independent spaces, mainly in capital cities around the continent, allow us to ship a box, and they just give away the copies to a totally different public that those that are frequent to museums or specialized bookstores, for example.
That's so, there are so many things I wanted to pick up on there, but that's such an interesting kind of counter narrative about the power of printed material to the kind of dominant idea of digital publishing, and how it kind of opens everything up and it's liberating and it connects people. I think it's really interesting what you just said. And Margarida, I noticed, I mean, I could see that there was something resonating with you there. So I wonder if could you speak to that at all, and your experience of kind of the various freedoms and or challenges that have come with distributing a physical magazine and all of the kind of logistical considerations that are involved in that. And then maybe both of you also as well, like the this idea of the kind of the tension between pursuing these decolonial alternative publishing practices and also the need to survive, not only as a publication, but as a publication within a kind of challenged art world. It would be interesting to hear both of your thoughts on that as well. Anyway, Margarida, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major challenges that we face within the Funambulist is basically to reach a broader readership. Most of the grounds that we cover, or most of the topics that we cover, are related to different political struggles, especially in the global South. The vast majority of our readership is based in the global North. And I mean, one issue of the publication, if you just buy a single copy, it's 20 euros, which is a significant amount. I mean, depending on where you're located, of course. And for us, I think we continuously strive to basically try to bridge this financial gap that we see. And I mean, this is also why we are continuously trying to find different ways of developing more content in open access. Somehow, the last project that I presented, the Funambulist correspondence, is only made possible through a very generous grant from the Graham Foundation, for instance, because we ourselves doesn't have the financial infrastructure to carry out this project. But I mean, I think somehow, even though I myself personally enjoy the physicality of the publication, I also do see the need to extend on the sort of more digital, the digital format, expand it, and in that way to reach a broader audience, and also to become useful in different contexts around the world. There was one thing that I specifically had in mind, and I think it related to something that you said, I think perhaps 5 minutes ago, but perhaps it comes up So I think, yeah, for now, I'll just leave it there. I mean, also again, as I was saying, that we have two open access platforms, so basically, so the blog, and then the podcast, which is also a way to make a content much more accessible globally in that sense.
Is it curious because we also our readership is mainly from the global north.
Yeah.
The first country that we are read according to Google Analytics, of course, it's kind of redundant, is Mexico and the US. Then is Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and then it's Spain, France, and Germany. So it's still mainly a readership from the global north. There's also in the decision of the editorial lines, there is a conscious that the main readership it's a north reader. I know that we're mainly speaking to assist a contemporary art system that is Western centric still. So there is some way in which sometimes, for example, criticism that comes to us is that sometimes we're very repetitive in the themes. Sometimes we are very mainly very repetitive. That's one of the main ones. Like, oh, you're always talking about decolonization. It's like, okay. Like, okay, yes, we're always talking about this because this is still an issue. There is a fundamental aspect in which how we think artistic practices and curatorial researches, there is still action through a logic of an anthropological logic, an archaeological, and it's mainly still a one that positions human and democracies as the center of a progressive political development in terms of discourse and criticality. It's still a system that denies the access to the system to racialized bodies. It's still a system that hierarchizes practices between, specifically in Mexico, between upper art and low art. Being low art, usually those traditional practices. So we're still in there. And as Margarida said, pointing out regarding the readership that they aided with, it was with the Chicago Architecture Biennial, right? Yeah, like as Margarida pointed out, the art system is very close to extractive and exploitative industries. Yeah. Almost all the money that finances the arts, it's a money marked by blood and exploitation. So they're on. We know in Terremoto that when we're editing these texts, these discourses, we're inhabiting a position of contradiction. And that is a point in which the art world is continuously trying to move away from contradictions. This is still a moral field in which it's trying to make the correct. Just see what just happened with Santiago Sierra's piece around indigenous blood. Yeah, like it's still a white-centered system. It's a system with a colonial capitalist in conscious, in words of Sueli Rolnik, in which is actioning mainly through guilt, and is trying to expel our own guilts as compliances of an exploitative system. So I believe that what the Funambulists do and what Terremoto does, or other publications such as Shock in Chile, for example, or other small magazines around the country that are starting to come up, are a way of starting to put in action politics of restoration, of repairment. In that sense, surviving as a non-profit magazine that not only translates but also keeps up a website pays to the contributors, we still do not pay as much as I would like to, because that's also a challenge. But we also limit it in several ways around. I will say that, for example, in terms of Mexico, it's very recent that funding grants or programs consider magazines or editorial non-books or non-academic or non-research-based editorial context as part of the possibilities to support. That's something very recent that changed maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when Terremoto right now has seven years going around. So I will say that is still something that we have to consider of that circulation. I do also believe that online and podcasts is something great, and we're trying to make it happen this year if possible. Because also the power of listening, that's also something as a strategy, or not only a strategy but a position of doubting our privileged positions in the world, where whiteness does not allow us to listen. So also a podcast has a sense of power in those terms, because you have to put attention, you have to be immersed in someone's voice. There's some time of erotization in that process that also makes the text to inhabit our bodies in a different way.
Oh, I like that a lot. Yeah, that's great. I want to come back to the. Oh, sorry, Margarida.
Just if you can add something to that. I mean,
please.
I mean, this is really the question, right, Diego? I think you're pointing at some very, very crucial things, and when we speak of publishing, the publishing industry or curatorial practice as such, or the way of kind of categorizing the way we preserve, or the way culture is preserved, the way culture or knowledge is produced and disseminated, which has basically historically been defined by a sort of Western worldview, right? I mean, publishing, just going back to publishing, that has been put at the center of this sort of colonial project. We're learning through the 20th century that these colonial impulses, or these colonial powers, imperial powers, basically used censorships and applied monopolies to basically apply even more violence towards racialized bodies or colonialized bodies. And so to this end, when this act of cultural production or knowledge formation has taken this shape of territory of domination that basically tends to advance certain kind of ideals that are defined by the West, again, how do we dismantle this? And if we yet today are still confronted with these sort of very cowardly tendency of confronting these realities, I mean, I think you're pointing to some very crucial things there. If I'm just allowed to just give one concrete example, a year ago when I was visiting Tanzania, I had these very great conversations with Walter Mgoya is his name. He is the founder of Mkuki na Nyota, which is an independent publishing house in Dar es Salaam. At the beginning of his career, he inherited the Tanzanian publishing house, which was the main publishing institution that was created by the British colonial rule in Tanzania, and then he found his way out of this very violent institution, and then established Mkuki na Nyota instead, which is basically very much about centering Black subjectivity. And this is a sort of ongoing process. I mean, it's very, very specific example is going away from the language of the colonizer, insisting on reaching their audience in Swahili, for instance, and applying different modes of disseminating this knowledge that they're producing in this particular publishing house. There's this strong sense of organizing and advocacy as like community organizing as a way to disseminate knowledge instead of sort of traditional way, or the ways that we perceive as traditional to reach audiences. So how could one learn from these sort of examples somehow to dismantle these structures that are somehow upheld by these Western societies? I'm not quite sure. I think these questions are extremely complex and complicated, and do not myself have the right answers to them. But I know that there are so many great examples out there, and both historical lessons and also more contemporary examples that we could potentially gaze at. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I mean, to follow up on that, thinking about those historical and contemporary examples, and also the fact that you've both kind of highlighted in different ways the art system as a kind of central institution of the sort of modern colonial world, and how, you know, art publishing is part of that institutional apparatus. I wonder if you think that there is conversely a kind of connection between, or sort of a sense in which alliances with artists and art worker kind of communities could hold a particular potential to move things in the opposite direction. So, like, you know, is there any particular potential within the art system to challenge colonial logics as well as to reproduce them? And is that, I don't know, is that a question of, I don't think I mean in terms of aesthetics, but maybe in a more kind of like, well, maybe I do. I don't know. I'm gonna pass this one over to you. Maybe also, I mean, we're running out of time, and we do have to take questions from the audience. I can't hog all the questions, but I think, Diego, you also briefly mentioned Mexico City, and that being a specific context in which kind of the art system and the sort of cluster of cultural institutions sort of sustains this kind of colonial centralism. So since we've got 5 minutes, maybe to end on, I kind of wanted to go deeper into the critique, but maybe let's talk about, you know, where you think the potential is, how you think the art world and art workers can be implicated in decolonial change, and maybe how you both envisage, or how you would envisage a sort of decolonial publishing or decolonial art publishing.
Well, I mean, the context in Mexico regarding the arts, for example, it's totally related into the creation of mestizaje, or mestizo, as a cultural policy of eugenistic homogenization of the population in Mexico. As I point out in the text that will be published following Arturo Abreu, there is this way in which modernism, in the terms of aesthetics, transforms the bodies of the racialized bodies in the context of Mexico, the indigenous and Afro-diasporic bodies, into raw material that from which they get inspiration to form the imaginary that in the 1920s, post-revolutionary, and until now, which is it's a discourse that is again emerged through this new government. They transform these bodies into real material that create the nation state imaginary. Of course, a nation state pointing more towards whiteness than towards another understanding of nations that inhabit these territories. They're on a way of engaging into the process of decolonization as art workers or art agents or cultural workers more than art. Is understanding also time non-linearly, as a lot of cultures in the global south understand. So, and here I'm following specifically Denise Ferreira da Silva, when she understands the entangled world also in terms of time and space, time being a colonial invention. Then what we suppose is a past is not a past, it's a present future that defines all the possibilities of life. Thereon, if we know that the cultural and art system contributed to the formation of the violence and power that is still killing and actioning and necropolitics in this territory, we have to take a stance towards it. And taking a stance beyond the performative politics of social media or image, taking a stance is also a way of imagining publishing beyond the paper and the letters. Is spoken word, is taking the floor, is allowing voices that are not usually contemplating the codes of rational arts or theorization or historization to be part of the process, is to move beyond that intelligibility system. Maybe make graffitis, make stencils, maybe just think collectively in the terms of packs. As we can see, the professionalization of the arts, since its context is neoliberalism. In Mexico, I can see it. It moved forward an individual logic. So for the artists, the curators, or almost all the people that we are part of the art system, it's very difficult to imagine collective ways of actioning. Because neoliberalization through the profanization of the arts installed the idea of authorship, and in that idea of authorship relies all the violence that doesn't allow us to recognize ourselves as others. Let's say, although the language is limited to the idea that I'm trying to portray. In that sense, I don't know, reading out loud, sharing, allowing ourselves to discuss a text. I'm constantly, right now, for example, in my therapy, I'm constantly repeating how lonely it feels, the political searching that I'm doing. Not only because of the present that we are in social isolation, the digitalization of life that makes the things more harder, and the weight of all that language. Like it's difficult for us to action in WhatsApp groups or in Zoom. There is a part that is missing, and we have to disobey in with certain responsibility that new biopolitics of the fear of the body that is not mine. And in that way, the arts, I have always understand the artwork or the art object as an extension of the body. Even though there is a certain autonomy of it when it's presented in the exhibition space, it's still an extension of the artist's body. And that artist's body is not possible individually. It's possible because it is related to others. And that is a Ubuntu philosophy aspect. So I am because I am the others. I am because we are together. In that sense, it's also, we have to question those epistemologies that form our own sense of what we understand as art agents, cultural workers, artists, curators, editors, writers, and we have to allow to those things to move towards an ethics of moving in this world.
Thank you. That is a lot of very inspiring thoughts there. Margarida, do you want to speak to that as well at all? And then I'll open it up to questions from the audience.
No, I don't have a specific point to this. I think what you just pointed at, very much spot on. Thank you for that.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, we have some great questions already in the Q&A. Please, anyone feel free to ask more if you have them. So the first one is from Dana Abdullah, who says, is it possible to create a community via publishing like it was in the 1960s and 1970s? Or what form does community take now via publishing practices where most publications are based largely around lifestyle? I guess sort of superficially meant. Would anyone like to offer thoughts on that? I suppose the ways in which we form what you were saying just now, Diego, about the use of online platforms, using WhatsApp, using Zoom. I think there is often a tendency to kind of assume community from these forms of connectedness where there isn't necessarily as substantial a sense of community that as perhaps some of these radical examples from the past might have, or we imagine they might have had. When you talk about building a community for your publications, I guess I hope this answers this gets at the question. Could you talk a little bit more about what it is that means to you, and how it might be, how the possibilities for community might be limited now in ways that perhaps they haven't been historically? Does that make sense to either of you?
Well, in that sense, maybe Margarida can tell us a little bit more of that Black Panthers issue, because I think there is a lot of consonance regarding this question.
Yeah, definitely. But basically, again, as I was saying, that this newspaper sort of, I mean, conceived to vocalize the Black struggle, and then encourage basically Black Americans to be a part of this community, and also imagining themselves as a part of a larger community, of a global community, in front of struggles across the world, as I mentioned, Palestine, Biafra, and so forth. I think perhaps I want to give you another practice-based example on Dana's question to this. The topic of community is something that is very, very present for everything that we do at the Funambulist. When we basically say that we are attempting to build or to mobilize this international or create a platform that allows different people from different geographical scale to build solidarity across to build solidarity. That's one way of how this community could basically be conceived through what we're attempting to do with our publishing activities. Another very specific example that I would like to speak a bit about is it's not that official yet, but it will hopefully within the next couple of weeks. We decided some time ago to establish a network, the Funambulist network, as we call it. It will be a part of a new website that we are currently developing. But basically this network would be this sort of database gathering all information about all our contributors. So whereas both their sort of expertises, their locations, and all sort of very, very important informations are listed, and where one could also be able to contact one another. And the idea of this is basically to give something back to our contributors, but again also try to push the sort of our activities beyond our own airwaves. No, to try to foster international dialogues. We've seen that happening amongst the graduate architects, which we featured with the very, very short project in the second half of 2020, where we kind of now see these amazing emerging architects coming together, discussing, learning from one another, and for me, it's amazing to see this happen, because I guess many of these people, and also on from my particular position, I mean, being trained within a certain kind of institution that has a very, very problematic way of seeing the world. I think it has been sort of, especially, again, for me, it has been very, very interesting and very important to try to find to find some allies, you know, to unlearn, or to have the space to vocalize our despairs and so forth. And so I guess the last meeting that we attended, Leopold and myself, was less than a month ago, where we tried to put these emerging architects together. And if this is the first step of trying to foster or trying to nurture a space for some community building between these practitioners, then I mean, that would be great for us if the project reaches that far. But one specific project is the Funambulist network, which we are very, very excited to launch very soon, and which we really hope will extend beyond the publication itself and just live sort of its own life.
In that sense, I think it's also very important, following what Margarida says, like, well, Dana's question is referencing the 1960s and the 1970s. And well, there was a conscious, for example, in the Black Panthers movement or the Pan-Africanism movement, in which they knew that they have learned the colonial language or the colonial logic. And there is a lot of pedagogic and educational efforts to unlearn, as Margarida points out, that logic. So what we print, what we publish, and it has to move to spaces of collective discussion, of collective reading, of reflection, of almost therapeutic understandings of the text, not only reading them or approaching them through a rational logic, but also through an emotional one. Like how does these words, how does these ideas affect my body, affect our bodies? How am I re-encountering myself when for example, in my experience, how do I re-encounter myself when I get pointed out the whiteness that I incarnate, or the heterosexuality that I incarnate, inevitably that I'm a fag, or like how I'm practicing that in a daily basis, who I'm related to, who I listen, who I'm friends with, like the idea of artistic practice beyond the object is the conscious of the habit that creates the world in a daily basis. So like there is a thing in resonating there. So actioning those spaces of pedagogy, of collective studying, it's a way to be a militant of these ideas. And that question also comes or also interpolates the organization of this event. Like, how are we going to do continuity to this that we're doing? When I'm going to see again Margarida, or when are we going again to have a conversation? Like those things like challenge our notions of work, of time in a project, like. And I'm thinking also in these conferences, I don't know, the Third World Conference or these alliances, the global alliances in those same ages that Dana pointed out, and that they had an agenda. They got together once or twice a year because they were pushing agendas towards hegemony. I'm thinking specifically in the Third World Alliance, for example. And they came together, discussed ideas that were affecting them, and then they were trying to push policies. What does it mean to do that in the art world? And in Europe, there's a conversation starting through the expoliated objects being returned to African countries and nations, but there's still very narrowed into that context. And anti-racist movements also are starting to articulate those ideas, mainly of immigrants in Europe. So you can see that there is a community-based link to publishing. We just have to put more attention to it and maybe come closer to those initiatives that are already happening.
And perhaps harness that idea of there being a shared struggle. There's a thing that these communities are working towards together. We have these are very kind of broad topics we've been talking about. I've noticed there are quite a few sort of practical questions, so maybe we could do we don't have very much time, maybe we could do a slight quick fire examples kind of thing. So the next we had an anonymous question. Someone asked if you have examples on ways to find funding without relying on kind of capitalist or colonialist structures. What would be some anti-capitalist, anti-colonial ways to finance a publication? And then there was another one also about much further down about now that because you are both magazines very much dependent on funding, are there any implications of that in terms of censorship from your financial contributors? If you are if you're able to talk about that. Maybe one quick example from each of you, if you have them, or just kind of like one quick thought on funding. What kinds of funding that publications interested in decolonization should be seeking out, and what one or two of the challenges of these of that kind of model are for your publications?
It's a hard one.
I
don't know. In our case, in Terremoto, for example, we have an auction a couple of weeks to funding. That's not anti-capitalist at all. But it's also the things that we have to do, because I mean, if we didn't do that auction, Terremoto will not have funding now. Today, we didn't have how to pay our staff. We are an 8-member staff. We're still small in some sorts of another. But I will say that we need more international funding programs, I will say, in that sense, that come from the north to the south specifically. Not only like as a way of also reparation of all the damage that the north has done, or the the world, the West specifically has done. For example, the only one that we can apply to is Prince Claus, which we already had last year. Thank you, Prince Claus. But then there's nothing else. Then we only rely on the private sector, whether it's collectors. We have a program in which we do an edition of an invited artist. We pay that edition to the artist. 50% of the income goes to them. The other 50% comes to us. I will say that more collaborative ways of thinking that it's hard because we have to pay staff, printing, writers, the website, translation. Like it's kind of hard to think in anti-colonial or anti-capitalist ways of funding in a colonial and capitalist world. It's kind of hard.
Yeah.
But I'm still trying to imagine that.
Yeah.
Margarida, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's I mean, that's a very, very good question. I mean, as for us, the magazine depends on its sales. So the question of funding and the question of external financial contributions is quite limited when we speak of the Funambulist. Of course, I mentioned the Graham Foundation because they have been the ones providing us some crucial grants the past years, and in particular now with this the Funambulist Correspondent Project, where we basically used the total amount of the budget or the funding that we received to pay the contributors, but otherwise the Funambulist as such it really depends on sales almost exclusively. So I don't. So yeah, perhaps my answer here is not really.
No, and I think a lot of magazines have to, even if they are not for profit. You know,
that's a position of contradiction. But I would like to add something. For example, in the last 3 years, we have noticed, because Terremoto, we've also print because publishing, advertising, I'm sorry, it's a part of our income. And we have noticed that from the last 3 years to now, museums do not contemplate a budget for advertising. Even though they are the institution of accumulation of value in the arts, they do not redistribute that value to publications that are not part of their structure. And that is something to consider. That less and less museums, year after year, answer us, I'm sorry, I don't have budget for advertising. So it's like, oh, so what do you want me to do? This is an ecosystem. So I think we have also to point out the notion of we're an ecosystem in terms of institutions, galleries, etc., etc.
Okay, I'm going to try and get in a few more questions. One was, okay, we'll have one more on financial questions, which is, when starting a publication and there's no sufficient budget to always pay for contributors, is it still, do you think it's still correct to commission? So without falling into the trap of offering visibility that could be exploitative, but still develop work that doesn't depend on you necessarily having the finances to do it. Are these, I mean, I'm not sure if these are dilemmas you've had to consider. This is quite hypothetical.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will just answer quite very, very briefly on this one. I think it's a matter of value the work that that people carry out for us. So valuing it by offering a honorarium. I mean, this is nothing that we sort of. This is not something that's even up for discussion in what we do. I think this is just has to be very clear that this is how we do things, without compromising. Although, as you also were pointing at, Diego, I mean, we would love to be paying more to contributors, but for the time being, we are doing what we can, but visibility is simply not good enough. I think it's no.
Yeah, no, I will second this. Like, because visibility is a trap of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Like, give me your work in exchange of visibility. But you're being marginalized systemically all this time. But don't worry, I'll give you visibility. Like, no, sorry, but no, it doesn't work like that anymore.
Thank you. Good, decisive answers. Okay. What was I going to ask you next? We had another anonymous question. Diego said in his introduction, Terremoto, that you distribute editorial power. Could you just expand a bit on how that is done?
Well, in that sense, when we have the budget, I usually invite a guest editor to articulate the whole issue. They usually are women or feminized bodies. We've done an issue with Pilar Tomkis Rivas from LA. We've done with Fernanda Brenner from Pivot in Brazil, with Lorena Tavares in Colombia, with Maria Elena Ortiz in Miami. Like I try to do that as with Zhou Jingpeng, our recent issue, which was a South-South dialogue with the Southeast Asia. So that's something that when I say distribute the editorial power, that's what I meant.
And what is the main argument for doing that? I think it's great. I really do think it's great. But what is
well, it's true. I will say that one is strategically, in the sense that I don't know the whole, like the whole heterogeneity of the region and specificities of it. And the second is a way of also distributing my own power of the editor, that is a cis gay man that benefits from whiteness and heterosexuality. So that way, how can I also move away from that notion of myself and bring a colleague, a friend, to think together issues that we're proposing. Usually the editorial process is a call with them, or if they're in the city, where we collaborate, we have conversations, we exchange references, texts, we're open to debates. We talk with a lot of people in the region, like very close people that I respect their work, their experience, not only in the arts, but in their communities. So yeah, like distributing the power is like also doubting of the certainties that I assume from my own position.
Bruno Freitas de Oliveira asks if you considered transporting the topics and issues covered in the magazine into material that could be used by primary and secondary art teachers. So I guess, yeah, I guess it would also be interesting to hear how much you know about the sort of educational function that the magazines already play, and who your audiences are.
Well, that would be great. But we have also education systems that make that very difficult in that sense, at least in Mexico, for example. But we have a possibility that is the educational or art pedagogists in our cultural sector. That is also something, and they use these texts, and I know they use them in, at least people that I know in the classrooms they open, whether there are the small courses or in universities, or I mean in primarily as secondary art teachers. It's something that it also, in the case of Mexico, well, teachers in public universities where art is an option, they are more arrogated into traditional, into plastic forms of understanding art practices, and so we're also confronting a generational break in that sense, in the context of Mexico, in which there's a lot of doubtings and ideas around contemporary art. They classified it as something like something fake or something that it's not what they're very conservators in that sense. So it's a hard one, but I know that that at least friends and colleagues that are integrating into those art education spaces, well, they use some of the texts that we publish and others that are published in other magazines or publications.
And I think on our end is mostly concerned architecture schools, architecture educations around the world, or in the US and in Europe. Sorry, I mean, Leopold, he had a 6 month visiting tutor where he served as a tutor in the US just two years ago, and then continuously attempting to engage architecture students into these conversations, because I mean, somehow and myself being trained as an architect, whereas a profession, whereas the political dimension has been removed somehow historically, but architecture basically serves a political power, right? It's embodiment of a certain ideological positioning. So how to basically propose an anti-normative reading of the built environment of the built environment, or propose an alternative that basically challenges existing architectural curricula. So trying to engage in conversations within architecture schools in Europe and in the US.
Right. We have 1 minute, but I'm just going to throw one more question in there before we wrap things up, which is that, Margarida, you mentioned community organizing as a way of just. Oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback from somewhere. Anyway, you mentioned community organizing as a way to disseminate knowledge. Can you or Diego share or elaborate on a case study or example that resonated most with that? And where did community organizing and knowledge dissemination meet there in the example? Does that make sense? I know you've already given a couple actually, and you spoke about community organizing a bit at the beginning of the Q&A, but just if there was anything, any particular project that we could end on.
I have a couple.
Great.
I mean, when I understand when Margarida said community organizing as a way to disseminate knowledge, I understand that as knowledge that comes from experiences that are confronting certain problematics or hegemonies, and from that confrontation, well, they complement the knowledge and disseminate it as tools to understanding what they have in common with others in the world, or in the specific world, the specificities of the world they inhabit. For example, there is Colectivo Ayllu in Madrid, that is a collective of immigrants in Spain, and well, they are part of the anti-racist and anti-colonial movement. And before being an art collective, it is a community-based collective that it opposes the racist logics of the Spanish government. Another example will be the collective of Rio Paraná in the South Argentina, that is of Duensachi and Mag de Santo, in which they also are reuniting or conjuring together voices of indigenous cultural agents, let's call it, that are part of bigger movements that go beyond the art world. They have a podcast in Spotify. It's only Spanish, but it's something that you should listen. There is also, for example, Maya Huracan and Diego Ventura in Guatemala, which they are part of the art world, but their compass in relation to the art world is mainly the community indigenous based art practices. They do not center the logics into understanding collection or art practice or curatorial speaking. And well, I think those are some of what you can find.
Sorry, thank you. I am aware that I need to wrap it up at this point. So I should say thank you to both of you so much for joining us and for having this conversation. I wish we could continue it for longer, and I hope that we will in some way. Thank you everyone who joined us. Thank you to our amazing translators, to MASP, Goldsmiths, UAL, thanks everyone. If the two of you want to stay on the line for a minute, I will just let everyone slowly disappear. Thank you. Okay, I've stopped the recording now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, both of you. Wait, I'll just let people leave the